My children told me, "Dad, stop calling us. We have our own lives. You need to stay on your own and figure it out." So, I did exactly that. I stopped calling them and I called my lawyer instead. Weeks later, when they desperately tried entering my estate, my newly hired private security escorted them out. But before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Everett. I just turned 71 years old. I am a retired architect, and I have spent my entire life building foundations, both out of concrete and out of love. I live in the Hudson Valley on a 15-acre estate that I designed and built with my own two hands, alongside my late wife, Corinne. Corinne passed away 5 years ago, and since then, the silence in this massive mid-century modern home has been my only constant companion. On the evening of my 71st birthday, I sat alone at the custom-built oak dining table. I had spent the afternoon preparing a roast, hoping against hope that my children would remember the date and come through the front door. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway, every chime a painful reminder of the empty chairs around me. I picked up my phone and dialed my son, Garrett. He is 38 years old, a serial entrepreneur who is always chasing the next big startup, yet perpetually drowning in debt from his failed ventures. When the call went straight to voicemail, I dialed my daughter, Sabrina. She is 41, a real estate agent who lives a lifestyle vastly beyond her actual means, constantly trying to impress a high society crowd. To my surprise, the line clicked, and I heard both of their voices. They had merged the calls. "Happy birthday to me," I said, trying to force a cheerful tone into my voice. "Are you two still coming over for dinner? I made the roast you both used to love." A heavy sigh echoed through the phone speaker. I could hear the clinking of expensive wine glasses and the low hum of background chatter. They were out at a restaurant together without me. Garrett's voice came through first, laced with pure, unfiltered irritation. "Dad, we put you on speakerphone because we are both really busy right now. We have a dinner reservation with some important clients." Before I could ask why they hadn't told me they were canceling our plans, Sabrina chimed in. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Dad, stop calling us. We have our own lives to manage. You need to stay on your own and figure it out. We are not your babysitters." The line went dead. Click. I sat there in the vast, echoing dining room, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I looked around the beautiful house Corinne and I had built. We had poured our blood, sweat, and tears into giving our children a perfect life. But in that moment, the devastating truth washed over me. My children did not see a grieving widower reaching out for connection on his birthday. They saw a persistent nuisance. They saw a burden. I did not cry. I am an architect. When a structure shows signs of critical failure, you do not weep over the cracks in the drywall. You inspect the foundation. And I realized my family's foundation was entirely rotten. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, I stood up, left the untouched roast on the table, and walked down the hall to my private study. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into my secure banking portal. For years, I had maintained a series of silent automatic transfers to keep my children afloat. Between Garrett's failing business ventures and Sabrina's obsession with luxury living, I was secretly funneling them $12,000 a month. I never rubbed it in their faces. I just wanted them to have a safety net. As I reviewed the outgoing transfers, A flashing red notification icon caught my eye. It was an urgent alert from my bank's fraud prevention department regarding an inquiry on the deed to my estate. My brow furrowed. I clicked the secure message, and my blood instantly turned to ice. Garrett and Sabrina had jointly submitted an application to use my 15-acre estate as collateral for a massive $500,000 commercial bridge loan. I opened the attached digital documents and stared at the screen in absolute horror. There, at the bottom of the authorization forms, was my digital signature. It was a flawless forgery. They had bypassed my primary email, intercepted the verification codes, and signed the documents, assuming that my age made me technologically illiterate. They thought I was just a senile old man who would never check his secure portals, someone who would quietly lose his home if their bridge loan defaulted. The audacity was suffocating. They had just told me on the phone to stay on my own and figure it out, while simultaneously attempting to steal the very roof over my head to fund their reckless lifestyles. This was not just disrespect. This was felony fraud. I sat in the glow of the computer screen for a long time, the betrayal burning through my chest. Then a cold, absolute calm settled over me. The kind of calm that only comes when you realize a relationship is dead and there is nothing left to salvage. I downloaded the forged loan documents. I exported years of bank statements proving the monthly allowances. I compiled every piece of evidence into a secure, encrypted folder. Then I picked up my phone. I scrolled to Garrett's contact profile. I looked at the picture of him smiling at his college graduation. I deleted it. I scrolled to Sabrina's profile, a photo of her laughing in the backyard of this very house. I deleted it. I did not call my children to yell. I did not demand an explanation. I scrolled down to the letter W and hit dial. The phone rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. "Kessler," I said, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion. "It is Everett. I need to sever some dead weight, and I need to buy a gate." The next morning, the sun rose over the rolling hills of the Hudson Valley, casting long shadows across my property. I dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that I had not worn since Corinne's funeral. I drove the 2 hours into the city, pulling up to a towering glass skyscraper, where my longtime attorney, Mr. Kessler, commanded the top floor. Kessler is a man in his late 60s, a ruthless, sharp legal mind who has handled my professional contracts for 3 decades. He greeted me at the door of his boardroom, took one look at my face, and knew exactly why I was there. I opened my briefcase and laid the paperwork out on the polished mahogany table. I showed him the forged loan applications. I showed him the IP addresses, proving the documents were submitted from Garrett's corporate office. I showed him the paper trail of the $12,000 monthly allowance I had been providing them for years. Kessler reviewed the documents in complete silence. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hard. "Everett," he said quietly, "they crossed a line you cannot uncross. This is federal wire fraud. I can have them in handcuffs by tomorrow morning." I shook my head. "No, Kessler. Putting them in jail is too easy. If they go to prison, they become victims in their own minds. They will blame me for ruining their lives. I want them to face the exact reality they demanded from me. They want their own lives. They want me to stay on my own. I am going to give them exactly what they asked for, but I am going to do it by cutting off every single drop of resources they rely on." We spent the next 4 hours drafting a brutal, airtight legal strategy. Kessler began initiating immediate freezes on all joint accounts, and halting every automatic transfer. But there was another layer to my plan. A layer my children were completely unaware of. You see, my children believed my wealth was tied up solely in the house and my standard retirement accounts. What they never knew, what I had kept hidden from them for over 20 years to ensure they valued hard work over inheritance, was that I did not just own the 15 acres my house sat on. Years ago, anticipating the suburban expansion, I had quietly purchased the commercial zoning rights to the surrounding 50 acres of prime real estate. I was sitting on a gold mine worth millions, an empire I had built in total silence. They thought they were stealing a house. They had no idea they were throwing away a kingdom. We finalized the paperwork. Kessler looked at me with a mixture of respect and solemn understanding. "Are you sure you are ready for the fallout, Everett? When the money stops, they are going to come for you." I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. "Let them come," I said. "I am the architect. I built their lives, and I know exactly how to demolish them." The quiet humming of the city traffic, far below Kessler's office, felt entirely disconnected from the financial execution taking place inside. Kessler did not hesitate. With the practiced efficiency of a man who had dismantled corporate empires, he began severing the lifelines my children had taken for granted. First came the immediate block on the fraudulent commercial bridge loan. A simple phone call to the bank fraud division, backed by the undeniable proof of forged digital signatures, stopped the $500,000 transaction dead in its tracks. I sat in the leather chair opposite his desk and watched as decades of misguided parental support were systematically dismantled. Next went the joint accounts. Over the years, I had maintained 2 high-yield checking accounts with Garrett and Sabrina, listed as authorized users. A safety net they had treated like an endless personal teller machine. With a few keystrokes and an emergency authorization mandate, those accounts were frozen solid. No withdrawals, no transfers, no credit line advances. The faucet was turned off. But the real blow, the one that would strip the camouflage from their lavish lives, was the cancellation of the automatic transfers. Every month, $12,000 vanished from my private estate trust and dispersed into their personal accounts. It was the silent engine powering their illusions of success. I told Kessler to cancel them permanently, but I did not stop there. I knew the exact rhythm of my children and their financial obligations. Today was Wednesday. In exactly 48 hours, the illusion would shatter. I knew this because I had spent the last 10 years bailing them out of their own careless timing. Friday was the day the automatic drafts hit. Garrett liked to call himself a serial entrepreneur, a title that sounded impressive at high-end cocktail parties. The reality was far less glamorous. His current venture, a tech consulting firm that produced nothing but bloated expense reports, had a payroll cycle that cleared every other Friday morning. I remembered when he started the company 3 years ago. He had come to me with a polished presentation, begging for seed money. I wrote the check because a father wants to believe in his son. But for the last 6 months, my secret transfers were the only reason his handful of employees received their paychecks. He had leveraged his lifestyle against my quiet generosity, assuming the invisible safety net would always catch his free fall. On Friday morning, when he tried to push payroll through his commercial account, he would hit a brick wall. There would be no grace period, no warning text from me, just a cold, hard, insufficient funds notification. He would be forced to look his employees in the eye and explain why their checks bounced. Sabrina and her reckoning would arrive on the exact same day, though hers was tied to something she valued far more than a business: social status. Sabrina and Brendan were members of the most exclusive country club in our county. It was a place where image was currency, where they rubbed elbows with old money families and pretended to belong. Their monthly membership dues, along with the lease payments for the 2 luxury utility vehicles sitting in their driveway, were scheduled to pull directly from the joint account I had just frozen. When her payment declined, it would not be a private matter. The club management was notorious for swiftly and publicly suspending the accounts of members who failed to pay. Sabrina would attempt to pay for a mimosa at the clubhouse on Friday afternoon, and her card would be declined in front of the very people she was so desperate to impress. The humiliation would be instantaneous and absolute. I left Kessler's office with a stack of confirmation receipts and drove back to the Hudson Valley. The 2-hour drive was the quietest journey of my life. For 38 years, I had conditioned myself to react to my children and their emergencies. If Garrett needed capital, I opened my checkbook. If Sabrina was in a bind, I smoothed it over. I had built a 15-acre estate with my bare hands, yet I had allowed my own children to treat me like a disposable resource. As I pulled my car up the long, winding driveway of my property, the sheer magnitude of what I had done finally washed over me. I parked the car and simply sat in the driveway, looking at the sprawling mid-century modern home. Corinne and I had designed every sharp angle and sweeping window. We had built it to be a gathering place, a sanctuary, for a family that, as it turned out, only existed in our hopes. I walked into the empty house, and the silence was deafening. But this time, the silence did not feel lonely. It felt clean. It felt like a sterile operating room, ready for surgery. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, leaning against the counter where Corinne used to stand. I could almost hear her voice echoing in the quiet space. "Everett," she used to say, her eyes full of that gentle but firm wisdom she always carried. "If you keep putting pillows under them every time they stumble, they will never learn how to brace for an impact. You are not protecting them. You are just delaying the crash." She had been right all along. My endless financial support had not fostered independence. It had bred unparalleled entitlement. They believed they were entitled to my money, entitled to my property, and ultimately entitled to my life. The 48-hour trap was now set. Wednesday night bled into Thursday morning. The hours ticked by with an agonizing slowness. I did not turn on the television. I did not listen to music. I spent the day walking the perimeter of my property, inspecting the giant oak trees, feeling the solid, unforgiving earth beneath my boots. I was grounding myself, preparing my mind for the emotional violence that was about to erupt. I checked my phone periodically, not to reach out, but to ensure the silence held, and it did. My children did not call me to ask how my birthday evening ended. They did not call to check on my well-being. They were completely absorbed in their own self-important lives, entirely unaware that the foundation beneath them had just been vaporized. Thursday night arrived, thick and heavy with anticipation. I made myself a simple dinner and sat at the very same dining room table where I had endured their callous birthday dismissal. I looked at my phone, resting silently on the polished wood. They thought they had put me in my place. They thought they had asserted their dominance by telling an old man to stay out of their way. They had no idea that their arrogant dismissal was the exact catalyst required to set them free from my bank accounts. I went to bed that night and slept more soundly than I had since Corinne passed away. I slept with the deep, dreamless peace of a man who has finally stopped trying to carry the weight of the world. When the sun crested over the hills on Friday morning, illuminating the vast green expanse of my estate. I woke up before my alarm. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee and carried my mug out to the back patio. The air was crisp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of incoming rain. I sat in my favorite rocking chair, resting my phone on the small wooden table beside me. The trap was armed. The financial systems were fully automated and absolutely unforgiving. At 9 in the morning, the banks would process the automatic drafts. At 9 in the morning, the checks would bounce, the accounts would lock, and the terrible, beautiful reality of their independence would crash down upon them. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid steady my nerves. I did not feel vengeful. I did not feel cruel. I felt like a master architect watching a poorly constructed building finally succumb to its own structural flaws. All I had to do now was wait in the silence, because I knew the screaming was about to begin. The financial traps were set, but a digital wall was not enough to keep out the storm that was coming. I knew my children. When their accounts locked and their credit cards declined, their first instinct would not be reflection. It would be pure, unadulterated rage. They would come to the estate demanding answers and demanding access. I needed a physical barrier to match the financial one I had just erected. I did not open a local directory to find a standard contractor. I called a private firm located in the city that specialized in rapid deployment security for high net worth clients. I told the operations director I needed an impenetrable perimeter established at the primary entrance of my 15-acre property, and I needed it fully operational in less than 24 hours. The director told me such a timeline was highly unusual and would incur an exorbitant premium. I told him money was not an object and wired a $50,000 retainer before we even hung up the phone. By noon on Thursday, my quiet Hudson Valley driveway was transformed into a highly coordinated construction zone. 3 heavy-duty utility trucks rolled up the long gravel path, followed by a flatbed carrying massive sections of solid wrought iron. A crew of 12 men, dressed in unmarked dark uniforms, stepped out and immediately went to work with the precision of a tactical military unit. They did not ask unnecessary questions. The foreman, a stoic man with a serious bearing, walked the perimeter of the main entrance with me. He evaluated the natural choke points created by the dense tree line and the slope of the hills. We agreed on the optimal placement for the primary barrier. Within an hour, excavators were tearing into the earth to pour rapid-curing industrial concrete for the gate pillars. The deep rumbling sound of heavy machinery echoed across the valley, shattering the usual peaceful silence of the estate. I stood on the porch with a cup of black coffee and watched the thick iron bars being hoisted into the air. It felt entirely surreal. I had designed this property to be open, welcoming, and integrated with the surrounding nature. Now I was turning my beautiful home into a fortress. As I watched the bright sparks fly from the welding torches, fusing the heavy iron joints together, my mind drifted back to Corinne. My beautiful, pragmatic Corinne. She had always possessed a clarity of vision that I lacked when it came to our children. I was the architect, always wanting to build things up, always wanting to smooth over the rough edges of their lives. Corinne was the absolute realist. She understood that a foundation needs to cure under pressure to be strong. I vividly remembered a rainy evening over a decade ago. We were sitting in the very same living room, and Garrett had just come to me, asking for a substantial loan to cover his second failed business venture. I had agreed immediately, writing the check without even asking to see his accounting records. Corinne had waited until he left before turning to me, with a look of profound disappointment. "Everett," she had said, her voice soft but laced with steel. You think you are being a good father by catching them every time they fall. But you are not. You are stealing their resilience. You are teaching them that their failures have no consequences, because you will always be there to absorb the impact. I had argued with her that night. I told her that my success was meaningless if I could not use it to make our children comfortable. I told her that Garrett just needed a little more time to find his footing, and that Sabrina just needed a little help maintaining her social standing to secure good real estate clients. Corinne had slowly shaken her head, looking at me with a sad, knowing expression. Overcoddling them is going to ruin them, Everett. If you never let them feel the pain of a scraped knee, they will eventually jump off a cliff, assuming you will provide a parachute. She warned me that my endless generosity was breeding a dangerous entitlement. She told me that one day they would stop asking for my help and start demanding it. They would stop seeing me as a father and start seeing me as an endless resource. I refused to listen. I thought my love could outrun their irresponsibility. But watching the security crew install the massive iron gates, I finally admitted the bitter truth. Corinne was right. She had been right all along, and my refusal to listen had created the very monsters I was now building a wall to keep out. My financial enablement had severely handicapped my own children, stunting their growth and turning them into greedy, dependent adults. The afternoon slipped into evening, and the construction crew worked relentlessly under towering halogen work lights. Once the primary iron gates were secured to the reinforced concrete pillars, the technology team moved in to install the hardware. This was not a simple keypad system. I had ordered the highest tier of access control available. The technicians mounted high-definition, night vision-capable surveillance cameras at multiple angles, ensuring there were no blind spots anywhere near the entrance or the perimeter fencing. These cameras were wired directly to a secure server inside my study, allowing me to monitor the live feed from a tablet anywhere in the house. Next came the access terminal itself. They installed a sleek, weatherproof biometric scanner mounted on a steel pedestal just outside the gate. It required a registered fingerprint to activate the hydraulic motors that opened the heavy iron doors. I stood in the cool evening air and placed my thumb against the glowing glass reader. The machine chimed a soft note of approval, and the massive gates swung open smoothly and silently. I stepped back and watched them close again, the heavy iron locking together with a resonant, final thud. The physical barrier was now complete. No one was coming up that driveway without my explicit biological consent. The security foreman handed me a master control tablet and a set of encrypted physical backup keys. He assured me the perimeter sensors would instantly alert my devices if anyone attempted to scale the surrounding stone walls or tamper with the gate mechanisms. The firm also provided a direct hotline to their dispatch center, guaranteeing a private armed response unit would be on site within 10 minutes of a triggered alarm. I thanked the foreman and walked back up the long gravel driveway to my house as the utility trucks packed up and rolled out into the dark. The deep silence of the Hudson Valley night returned, but it felt entirely different now. The open, vulnerable estate was gone. In its place stood an impenetrable castle. I walked into the house and locked the heavy wooden front door behind me. I went into the study and mounted the security tablet on my desk. The high-definition screens showed the iron gate standing tall and unyielding under the glow of the security lights. The driveway was empty. The road beyond it was pitch black. I sat in my leather chair and looked at a framed photograph of Corinne resting on my bookshelf. I whispered a quiet apology into the empty room, asking her to forgive me for taking so long to learn the lesson she had tried to teach me. I had finally stopped trying to be their parachute. I had finally built the wall they needed to hit. I turned off the desk lamp and went upstairs to sleep, knowing that when the sun rose on Friday morning, the financial bomb would detonate, and my children would find themselves completely locked out of the kingdom they thought they owned. The dawn on Friday arrived exactly like any other, yet the air felt thick with an electric anticipation. I woke up just before 6, the faint sunlight creeping through the bedroom blinds, casting long, familiar shadows across the hardwood floor Corinne and I had laid together. I did not rush. I took a long, hot shower, shaved with deliberate care, and dressed in a comfortable pair of slacks and a crisp collared shirt. Today was the day the illusions shattered, and I wanted to be fully awake, sharp, and present to witness the fallout of my lifetime of enabling. I walked down the sweeping staircase to the kitchen, the silent house feeling remarkably vast and sturdy. I measured out my favorite dark roast coffee, listening to the comforting drip of the machine and enjoying the rich, bitter aroma as it began to brew. As I poured the steaming liquid into my mug, the absolute quiet of the morning was abruptly broken. My phone, resting innocently on the granite countertop, began to vibrate. Then it buzzed again and again. The screen lit up with a rapid, frantic succession of notifications, illuminating the dark kitchen tiles like a warning beacon. The dominoes I had carefully aligned were officially beginning to fall. I picked up the device and looked at the lock screen. The first wave of absolute panic belonged to Garrett. He had sent 7 text messages in the span of 3 minutes. The messages evolved quickly, from mild confusion to outright breathless desperation. "Dad, did you change your bank routing number? Dad, the transfer did not go through. Call me back immediately. Dad, my payroll just bounced. My employees are threatening to walk out. Pick up the phone." I read the words slowly, letting the reality of his situation sink in. I could picture him perfectly, sitting in his overpriced, glass-walled corporate office in the city, sweating right through his tailored designer suit as his entire reality crumbled beneath his feet. For years, he had played the role of the successful, untouchable tech visionary, handing out paychecks that were entirely funded by my silent, foolish charity. Without my money, he was nothing but an imposter with a bloated overhead and an empty bank account. The invisible safety net had vanished into thin air, and he was currently plummeting toward the hard, unforgiving concrete of consequence. Before the screen could even dim, the phone vibrated violently in my hand once more. This time, the incoming barrage was from Sabrina. Her messages were typed in erratic, fragmented sentences, fully displaying the hysteria that was rapidly taking hold of her. "Dad, what is going on with the joint account? My card just declined at the country club. I am so humiliated. Brendan is furious. The leasing company just flagged our luxury utility vehicles for non-payment. They are threatening repossession. Answer your phone." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The bitter, strong taste matched the situation perfectly. I could see her in my mind's eye, standing in the opulent marble foyer of her elite country club, her face flushed red with profound shame, as the cashier handed back her declined platinum card in front of her wealthy friends. I could easily imagine Brendan, her arrogant husband, who always looked at me like I was an irrelevant relic of the past, suddenly realizing his lavish, boastful lifestyle was completely dependent on the very man he so openly despised. They were learning the hard way that an empire built on someone else's dime can be repossessed in a matter of seconds. The frantic text messages quickly transitioned into relentless phone calls. Garrett called twice, Sabrina called 3 times. Then Garrett called again. The phone vibrated endlessly against the granite counter, a desperate mechanical heartbeat pleading for a sudden bailout. I did not answer. I did not even press the button to decline the calls and send them to voicemail. I simply let it ring, allowing them to experience the agonizing, stretching silence of an unanswered plea. Just days ago, they had specifically told me to stop calling them. They had explicitly demanded that I stay on my own and figure it out, because they were too busy with their own important lives. I was merely respecting their harsh boundaries with absolute, unrelenting compliance. I silenced the ringer completely, slipped the heavy phone into my pocket, and picked up my coffee mug. I carried my coffee out to the back porch and sat in my favorite wooden rocking chair. The morning dew was still clinging to the expansive lawn, and the estate looked incredibly peaceful under the bright morning sun. But my attention was not on the beautiful landscape Corinne and I had curated. I pulled my security tablet from the side table and rested it squarely on my lap. The high-definition screen displayed the live feed from the massive iron gates at the bottom of the long gravel driveway. The thick metal bars stood resolutely, an uncompromising physical barrier separating my hard-earned peace from their incoming chaos. I took another slow sip of coffee, feeling a profound, heavy sense of closure wash over my chest. For decades, I had bent over backward to accommodate their endless crises. I had compromised my own retirement, my own peace of mind, to ensure they never had to face the ugly reality of their poor decisions. But that era of foolish generosity was officially over. I watched the digital clock on the tablet screen tick upward, minute by minute. Their initial panic would very soon metastasize into blinding fury. They would never accept a declined card or a bounced payroll without a physical, demanding confrontation. They would try to storm the castle, fully expecting to browbeat a lonely, grieving old man into quiet submission. They thought they could simply drive up here, demand my checkbook, and resume their parasitic existence as if nothing had changed. I kept my eyes locked on the surveillance feed of the empty, winding road leading to my gates. I did not feel fear. I did not feel any regret. I simply felt ready. I took a deep breath of the crisp Hudson Valley air, watching the empty driveway on the screen. I knew they were coming. The sleek tires of a silver luxury sedan screeched around the sharp curves of the Hudson Valley Highway. Inside the immaculate leather interior, Garrett gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. Sweat beaded on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair and soaking into the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. He pressed the accelerator closer to the floor, ignoring the speed limit completely. Beside him, his wife, Delaney, stared at her phone with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She was furiously refreshing her banking application, praying for a different result that simply would not come. Garrett slammed his hand against the steering wheel, letting out a frustrated shout. He told Delaney that his father was just an old man who did not understand technology. He muttered that his father probably clicked the wrong button on his tablet and accidentally flagged the account. Garrett insisted that had to be the problem, because there was no other logical explanation. Delaney did not look up from her screen. Her voice was sharp and laced with a terrifying hysteria as she reminded Garrett that her elite spa membership was just declined. She complained that the receptionist had looked at her like she was a common criminal. She threatened Garrett that if his father ruined their perfect credit score because he forgot a simple password, she was going to completely lose her mind. Garrett swallowed hard, ignoring the knot of pure dread forming in his throat. The bounced payroll was a nightmare he could barely process. His employees were demanding answers, and his vendors were threatening to cut off his supply lines. He desperately needed that $12,000 transfer. He needed the joint account to remain open and active. Without that invisible financial safety net, his entire identity as a successful tech visionary was nothing but a fragile house of cards waiting to collapse. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, convinced that a quick, loud conversation with his father would resolve the entire issue. He planned to just walk into the house, demand the banking credentials, and fix the old man's silly technical error. Miles behind them, on the very same winding road, Sabrina was driving her pristine luxury utility vehicle with equal desperation. Her husband, Brendan, sat in the passenger seat, angrily adjusting his designer watch and muttering insults under his breath. Sabrina kept glancing in the rearview mirror, checking her flushed face and trying to steady her ragged breathing. The humiliation she had just endured at the country club was burning a hole right through her chest. Her wealthy friends had seen her premium card decline. The club manager had loudly asked her to provide an alternative form of payment in front of the entire dining room. It was the absolute worst moment of her entire life, and she blamed her father entirely. Brendan aggressively unbuttoned his suit jacket and glared out the window. He told Sabrina that her father had officially lost his mind. Brendan angrily reminded her that they should have taken control of his finances years ago. He called his father-in-law a senile old fool playing with a computer he did not understand. Brendan insisted the old man probably fell for a phishing scam and locked the entire estate trust out of sheer incompetence. Sabrina gripped the steering wheel, trying to hold back her angry tears. She nodded in furious agreement with her husband. She declared that her father was totally incompetent. She complained that she told him to stay on his own and figure it out, but obviously he could not even manage a simple bank transfer without destroying their lives. Sabrina promised Brendan that when they arrived, she was taking her father's phone and his laptop away. She planned to get the power of attorney paperwork started on Monday morning. She refused to let an old man jeopardize their social standing because he was too old to use the internet. They were all completely blinded by their own massive arrogance. It never even occurred to Sabrina or Brendan that this financial blockade was intentional. They had spent their entire adult lives treating their father like a bottomless well of resources. They truly believed he was a lonely, grieving widower who would do absolutely anything to keep them happy. The idea that he possessed the strength to cut them off deliberately was a concept their entitled minds simply could not process. They were driving toward the estate with the furious, righteous indignation of spoiled children who had been suddenly denied their favorite toys. The silver sedan and the white utility vehicle finally converged at the base of the mountain road leading up to the estate. Garrett spotted his sister in his rearview mirror and honked his horn loudly, signaling his shared frustration. Sabrina flashed her headlights in response, pressing her foot down to keep pace with her brother. Together, the two luxury vehicles roared up the familiar rural highway, tearing through the quiet afternoon like a mechanical storm. Inside his car, Garrett began rehearsing the speech he was going to deliver. He was going to march through the heavy wooden front doors, find his father in the study, and loudly demand the immediate restoration of his funds. He was going to use his loudest, most authoritative corporate voice to bully the old man into submission. He imagined his father apologizing profusely, looking small and confused behind his big oak desk. Garrett felt a surge of aggressive confidence. He was the successful entrepreneur. He was the man in charge. His father was just a retired relic who needed to be handled and managed. In the other vehicle, Sabrina was rehearsing her own dramatic entrance. She planned to cry just enough to make her father feel incredibly guilty for the embarrassment she suffered at the country club. She would tell him that his foolish technological mistake had caused her severe emotional distress. She knew exactly how to play the victim and manipulate his paternal instincts. Brendan sat beside her, cracking his knuckles, fully prepared to intimidate the old man and seize total control of the banking portals. The green trees blurred past their windows as they approached the final stretch of the scenic road. The estate was located just over the next sweeping hill. They were entirely focused on their anger, completely unaware of the harsh reality waiting for them. They thought they were driving up to an open, vulnerable house, inhabited by a weak old man who would instantly cave to their loud demands. They had no idea they were racing blindly toward a heavily fortified castle. They had no idea that the man waiting for them was not a confused victim of a banking error, but a master architect who had meticulously engineered their absolute ruin. The expensive tires chewed up the asphalt as the two cars crested the final hill, completely unprepared for the massive, immovable iron reality that was about to stop them dead in their tracks. The silver sedan tore off the main rural highway, leaving a massive cloud of dust and loose gravel in its wake, as Garrett took the familiar sharp turn onto the private road leading to the estate. He was moving dangerously fast, fueled by the potent mixture of adrenaline and absolute financial panic. He fully expected the long, sweeping driveway to open up before him, offering a clear and unobstructed path straight to the front doors of his father's house. But as the luxury vehicle crested the final small incline, Garrett was forced to slam both of his feet onto the brake pedal with terrifying force. The heavy car skidded violently across the pavement. The anti-lock braking system shuddered and whined as the tires screamed against the asphalt. The acrid smell of scorched rubber instantly filled the pristine leather cabin. Delaney lurched forward hard against her seatbelt, letting out a sharp, breathless shriek of sheer terror. Just inches from their expensive front bumper stood a massive, unyielding wall of solid black iron. Garrett sat completely frozen, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his hands shook as the dust slowly settled around the hood of his car. His brain absolutely refused to process the towering image filling his windshield. Where there used to be a simple, open stone entryway, flanked by perfectly manicured hedges, there was now a heavily fortified security gate. Thick, impenetrable iron bars stretched high into the blue morning air, anchored deeply by freshly poured concrete pillars that looked like they belonged to a maximum security federal facility rather than a retired architect's quiet Hudson Valley home. Sleek, high-definition surveillance cameras were mounted at the very top of the structure. Their dark glass lenses pointed directly down at the windshield of the sedan. A glowing biometric access terminal stood on a heavy steel pedestal, just out of reach. It was not a construction detour. It was not a mistake. It was a deliberate, expensive, and absolute blockade. The initial shock lasted for only a few seconds, before a blinding, entitled rage took over completely. Garrett slammed his open palm down onto the center of the steering wheel. The car horn blared instantly. It was a long, aggressive, echoing sound that completely shattered the serene morning quiet of the valley. He held his hand down, letting the horn scream for 10 continuous seconds, fully expecting his father to come running out of the house in a panic to see what was wrong. He expected the heavy gates to miraculously swing open in fearful obedience, but the heavy iron simply stood there, entirely indifferent to his corporate tantrums. Delaney covered her ears and screamed at him to stop, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency as the reality of their locked accounts and this locked gate began to violently collide in her mind. Right behind them, the white luxury utility vehicle skidded to a similarly chaotic halt, nearly rear-ending the silver sedan. Sabrina threw her hands up in utter disbelief, her mouth hanging open as she stared through her windshield at the imposing fortress her childhood home had suddenly become. She frantically unbuckled her seatbelt, but her husband, Brendan, was already moving. He threw the passenger door open so forcefully it bounced back on its hinges. Brendan stormed past the idling silver car, his face flushed a deep, furious crimson. He was a man who was entirely used to getting his way, a mid-level manager who bullied his subordinates for a living. He marched directly up to the iron gate, grabbing the thick black bars with both hands and shaking them violently. The heavy metal did not even rattle. It was anchored deep into the earth. Brendan stepped back, his chest heaving, and spotted the sleek access terminal mounted on the steel pedestal. He marched over to it and began furiously jabbing his fingers at the polished glass screen, searching blindly for a call button or a keypad. He found a small silver intercom button and pressed it down hard, leaning his face so close to the speaker, his hot breath fogged the metal. He roared into the microphone, demanding that Everett open the gate right this second. He screamed that they knew he was in there, playing silly games with the bank accounts. Brendan threatened that if the gate was not opened immediately, he would call the police and have the old man dragged out of the house for elder endangerment. Garrett finally threw open his driver's side door and stormed up to stand right beside his brother-in-law. He was practically vibrating with anger, pointing a shaking finger directly into the lens of the primary surveillance camera overhead. He shouted at the camera that this was not funny anymore. He screamed that his payroll had just bounced and demanded to know if his father had any idea what he had just done to his company. Garrett demanded that the gate be unlocked and the new routing numbers be handed over right this second. He yelled that his father needed to stop throwing a childish tantrum just because they missed one stupid birthday dinner. They stood there shoulder to shoulder, two grown men throwing an absolute fit on the other side of a fortified wall, waiting for the frail old man they had so casually dismissed to answer their loud demands. But the voice that finally broke the silence did not belong to their father. It did not come from the intercom speaker at all. It came from the dense tree line, just to the right of the concrete pillars. A heavy reinforced door, built seamlessly into the natural landscaping, swung open, revealing a discreet, climate-controlled guardhouse that had been entirely invisible from the road. A man stepped out into the morning sun. He was not a local neighborhood watch volunteer or a friendly community patrolman. He was a highly trained operative from an elite private security firm. He was tall, broadly built, and dressed in a spotless tactical black uniform with absolutely no identifying company logos. A secure earpiece rested discreetly in his left ear, and a heavy, utility-laden belt wrapped around his waist. His posture was perfectly straight, and his expression was entirely unreadable. He looked like a man who was paid a very premium salary to remain absolutely unbothered by wealthy people throwing tantrums. In his right hand, he held a simple black aluminum clipboard. The security guard walked slowly and deliberately toward the thick iron gate, coming to a stop just a few feet away from where Garrett and Brendan were standing. He did not look intimidated. He did not look angry. He simply looked at them with the cold, assessing gaze of a professional evaluating a minor perimeter disturbance. Brendan immediately redirected his fury toward the new target. He barked at the guard, pointing an aggressive finger through the iron bars, stating that he did not know who the guard was or what kind of scam he was running on his father-in-law. Brendan commanded the guard to open the gate right now, claiming they were family and had legal rights to be on the property. He threatened to have the guard arrested for trespassing and unlawful imprisonment if the gate remained closed. The guard did not flinch. He did not reach for his radio. He calmly looked down at the clipboard in his hand, flipping a single page over with a slow, deliberate motion. He reviewed the information for a brief second before looking back up, meeting Brendan's furious, red-faced glare with absolute, chilling tranquility. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep, steady, and completely devoid of any customer service warmth. It was the voice of an immovable object. He informed them, in a remarkably calm tone, that he was going to need all of them to step away from the access terminal. He stated clearly that this was a private restricted estate and that they were currently blocking the primary access road. Garrett grabbed the iron bars, his knuckles turning stark white. He pleaded with the guard, his voice shifting rapidly from anger to a desperate, high-pitched panic. He tried to explain that his father was inside and that his name was Everett. Garrett frantically identified himself as the son and pointed to Sabrina, claiming she was the daughter. He begged the guard to just call the house on the radio and tell Everett that his children were outside. Garrett babbled nervously that his father had just made a simple mistake with the bank and would surely tell the security team to let them inside if they just called him. The guard slowly lowered the clipboard. He looked directly into Garrett's desperate, sweating face, completely unmoved by the frantic explanation. He did not reach for his radio to verify the story. He did not ask for their identification. He simply stood perfectly still on the other side of the impenetrable iron barrier, because he already knew exactly who they were. The guard stood perfectly still, holding his black aluminum clipboard. He did not blink. He did not show a single ounce of empathy or understanding. He simply stared down at Garrett, with eyes that had dealt with far worse threats than a panicking man in a wrinkled designer suit. Garrett felt his chest heave as he waited for the guard to reach for the radio and call up to the main house. He expected the man to apologize for the misunderstanding and immediately punch the code into the biometric scanner. But the guard did nothing of the sort. He simply planted his boots firmly on the asphalt and looked at the two furious men standing on the wrong side of the iron bars. Garrett felt a new, much hotter wave of panic rising in his throat. He grabbed the thick metal bars with both hands, shaking them with whatever strength he had left. He screamed into the crisp morning air, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "We are his children. Open the gate. We have a right to be here. My business is falling apart, and I need to speak to my father right this second. Open the gate." The guard did not move his hands toward the gate controls. He did not reach for his radio. He lifted his chin slightly, projecting his voice so that it carried clearly over the idling engines of the two luxury vehicles. His tone was smooth and entirely devoid of negotiation. "Mr. Everett has explicitly revoked your access to the property. You are trespassing on a private estate. I need you to return to your vehicles and turn them around immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Brendan stepped back, his mouth falling open as the reality of the statement washed over him. Delaney let out a loud, hysterical sob from the passenger seat of the silver sedan, burying her face in her hands. She knew exactly what those words meant. The endless stream of money was gone. The bank accounts were not locked because of a technical error or a phishing scam. They were locked because the man they had treated like a disposable wallet had finally decided to shut the vault. Sabrina could not process the rejection. The blistering humiliation she had just suffered at the country club was still burning fresh in her mind. Her friends had whispered about her declined card. The club manager had looked at her with polite disgust. She had driven all the way up this mountain, fully prepared to scream at her father for embarrassing her. The idea that she was now being turned away by a hired employee was completely unacceptable. Sabrina threw open the door of her white utility vehicle and marched toward the iron gate. Her high heels clicked aggressively against the pavement. Her face was contorted with a mixture of blinding rage and sheer disbelief. She pushed past her husband and her brother, throwing her entire body weight against the thick iron bars. She screamed that she was not leaving until her father came down the driveway and faced her like a man. She wedged her arms through the gaps in the iron, trying to reach the glowing biometric scanner on the steel pedestal. She was thrashing wildly, clawing at the empty air, her manicured nails scraping against the cold metal casing. Sabrina demanded that the guard step aside, claiming she would climb the fence if she had to. She yelled that she was the daughter of the man who owned this land, and no hired help was going to keep her away from what was rightfully hers. She was completely out of control, throwing a massive physical tantrum right there on the asphalt. The primary security guard did not engage with her chaotic thrashing. He simply took one step backward, putting himself out of her reach, and raised his left hand toward the hidden reinforced door in the tree line. It was a silent, tactical signal. The heavy door swung open instantly. 2 more security guards stepped out from the climate-controlled guardhouse. They were built just like the first one, towering, broad-shouldered, and dressed in identical unmarked black tactical uniforms. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. They did not run or shout. They simply marched forward, coming to a stop directly behind the iron gate. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a human wall of solid muscle and unyielding authority. The sudden appearance of reinforcements completely shattered the children's remaining bravado. Sabrina stopped screaming, her arms falling limply to her sides as she stared at the 3 imposing men. Garrett took a slow, trembling step backward, his hands slipping off the iron bars. Brendan quickly grabbed his wife by the arm, pulling her away from the gate. The sheer physical intimidation was overwhelming. They were not dealing with a lonely old man they could bully into submission. They were facing a highly trained security detail that would not hesitate to use force if they tried to breach the perimeter. They were completely and utterly outmatched. High above the chaos, sitting comfortably in his private study, Everett watched the entire scene unfold on his high-definition security tablet. He leaned back in his leather chair, holding his warm mug of black coffee. The live feed captured every detail with absolute crystal clarity. He could see the sweat dripping down Garrett's panicked face. He could see Sabrina crying furiously into her hands as Brendan pulled her away from the gate. He could see the sheer, absolute terror in Delaney's eyes as she stared out from the passenger seat of the sedan. For 38 years, Everett had fixed every mistake they ever made. He had written the checks. He had paid off the debts. He had absorbed their disrespect and their arrogance, because he thought that was what a loving father was supposed to do. He had let them walk all over him, out of a misguided sense of duty. But looking at the security feed, he realized he was finally completely free. He did not feel an ounce of guilt. He did not feel a shred of pity. He felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. The heavy burden he had been carrying for decades had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Everett carefully placed his coffee mug down on the wooden coaster resting on his desk. He leaned forward and pressed his finger against the silver intercom button on the security console. The audio link established a direct connection to the powerful speakers mounted on the concrete pillars outside the gate. He took a slow, deep breath, gathering every bit of strength and closure he possessed. His voice, when he spoke, was not angry or vindictive. It was calm, steady, and filled with absolute finality. "You told me to stay on my own," Everett said, his voice booming clearly over the hidden outdoor speakers. The sound echoed across the driveway and rolled down the quiet rural valley. Down at the gate, all four of them froze instantly. Garrett snapped his head up, staring wildly at the security cameras. Sabrina stopped crying, her eyes wide with shock. Brendan and Delaney sat completely paralyzed in their vehicles. "I took your advice," Everett continued, the smooth cadence of his voice completely dominating the space. "Goodbye." He released the intercom button, cutting the connection permanently. He did not wait to see their reactions. He did not want to hear their desperate apologies or their furious screams. He simply sat back in his chair and watched the silent video feed, knowing the transaction was officially complete. Down at the base of the driveway, the three security guards received their final orders through their secure earpieces. The primary guard stepped forward, pointing a firm, authoritative finger directly at Garrett and Brendan. He commanded them to return to their vehicles immediately. He stated that the property owner had issued a final directive and that any further resistance would result in an immediate police response and formal trespassing charges. He ordered them to put their cars in reverse and back slowly down the gravel road. Garrett stared up at the surveillance cameras for one long, agonizing second. His chest heaved as the crushing realization set in. There would be no negotiation. There would be no bailout. The company he had built on his father's money was going to collapse by the end of the day. He turned around, his shoulders slumping in total defeat, and slowly walked back to the silver sedan. He opened the door and fell into the driver's seat, ignoring Delaney's frantic sobbing. He gripped the steering wheel and shifted the transmission into reverse. Brendan dragged Sabrina back to their white utility vehicle. She was still weeping bitterly, her hands trembling as she climbed into the passenger seat. Brendan slammed the door shut and jogged around to the driver's side. He did not look back at the guards. He put the vehicle in reverse, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the rearview mirror. The three security guards did not just watch them leave. They marched forward in perfect unison, stepping out from behind the heavy iron gate. They flanked the two luxury vehicles, using hand signals to direct the slow, humiliating retreat. Garrett and Brendan were forced to inch their expensive cars backward down the long, winding driveway. The guards walked alongside them, ensuring they did not stop or attempt to turn around on the private property. It was a slow, agonizing march of total defeat. The gravel crunched loudly beneath the tires, echoing the sound of their massive, spectacular failure. The guards escorted the two vehicles all the way down to the base of the mountain road, physically pushing them off the private estate and out onto the public highway. Once the tires crossed the property line, the guards stopped. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the edge of the asphalt, watching as Garrett and Brendan finally shifted their cars into drive. The silver sedan and the white utility vehicle slowly pulled away, merging into the light morning traffic. They looked small and entirely insignificant as they disappeared around the bend in the road, driving back toward a reality they could no longer afford to live in. The guards turned around and marched back up the hill, disappearing behind the solid, impenetrable black iron bars. The heavy gate stood resolute, guarding the quiet, beautiful estate. Inside the main house, Everett picked up his coffee mug, taking a long, satisfying sip. The coffee tasted perfect. The house was completely silent, and for the first time in his life, the silence felt absolutely magnificent. The silver sedan and the white utility vehicle pulled into the empty, cracked asphalt parking lot of a deserted strip mall just 3 miles down the highway. The engines idled loudly, ticking as the heat radiated from the hoods. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody stepped out of the cars. The profound humiliation of being physically escorted backward down a driveway by hired muscle hung heavy in the stifling air of the vehicles. Garrett gripped the leather steering wheel, his chest heaving, as the catastrophic reality of his situation finally settled deep into his bones. His company was dead. The payroll had bounced. His phone was flooded with furious messages from employees and vendors who were demanding money that he simply did not possess. He shoved the car into park and threw his door open. Stepping out into the warm morning air, he began to pace frantically back and forth across the faded white parking lines, dragging his hands through his perfectly styled hair until it stood up in frantic, messy spikes. A moment later, the doors of the utility vehicle slammed shut. Sabrina stumbled out, her designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, completely failing to hide her running mascara and the puffy red skin around her eyes. Brendan followed her, his face a mask of purple, absolute fury. He was already shouting into his cell phone, desperately trying to negotiate an extension with the leasing company that was currently hunting down their luxury vehicles. He hung up the phone and cursed loudly, kicking a loose piece of gravel across the lot. Delaney stepped out of the passenger side of the silver sedan, but she was not crying. Delaney was a woman who valued her social standing above absolutely everything else in her life. The realization that her credit cards were locked and her elite spa memberships were declining did not fill her with sadness. It filled her with a cold, venomous, and entirely unforgiving rage. She slammed the car door with enough force to shake the vehicle and marched directly toward her husband. She did not offer him a comforting embrace. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at his chest, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She demanded to know how Garrett had allowed a frail, retired old man to completely dismantle their entire lives in the span of a single morning. She screamed that she was not going to go back to her friends and admit they were bankrupt because his father had thrown a childish temper tantrum. Garrett looked at his wife, his eyes wide and desperate. He pleaded with her, throwing his hands up in the air, asking her what she expected him to do against a wall of solid iron and a team of private tactical security guards. He yelled that his father had completely cut them off, that the money was simply gone, and that there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. Delaney stood perfectly still for a moment, her eyes narrowing as her mind worked through the problem with ruthless efficiency. The anger in her face slowly morphed into something far more dangerous. It was pure, icy calculation. She lowered her hand and looked back toward the highway leading to the estate. Her voice dropped to a calm, terrifying whisper. She told Garrett that they were looking at this entirely the wrong way. She stated that normal, healthy, loving fathers do not wake up one morning, freeze their children's bank accounts, and hire armed mercenaries to block their own driveways. She slowly turned to look at the group, her eyes gleaming with a sudden dark realization. She declared that Everett had completely lost his mind. Brendan stopped pacing and looked over at Delaney, the angry flush slowly fading from his face as he processed her words. A slow, sinister smile began to spread across his lips. He walked closer to the group, his corporate managerial instincts taking over. He agreed with Delaney completely. He pointed out that Everett had been grieving alone in that massive empty house for 5 long years since Corinne passed away. Brendan suggested that the grief and the isolation had finally broken the old man's fragile brain. He confidently stated that the sudden installation of high-tech biometric scanners and iron gates was not the action of a rational parent. It was the textbook definition of severe, unchecked paranoia. Sabrina wrapped her arms around herself, looking nervously between her husband and her sister-in-law. She asked what they were supposed to do about it, wiping her eyes, when he had already thrown them out onto the street. Delaney stepped closer to Sabrina, placing a remarkably gentle, entirely fake hand on her shoulder. She told Sabrina that they were not going to let their beloved father suffer through a mental breakdown all alone. She said that Everett was clearly a danger to himself and his finances, and that he was obviously being manipulated by someone. Delaney's eyes widened as she found the perfect scapegoat. She loudly announced that it was Kessler. She claimed that the sleazy, high-priced lawyer had poisoned the mind of a sick, senile old man, tricking Everett into locking his own family out so Kessler could slowly drain the estate trust for himself. The twisted, deeply fabricated narrative completely consumed them. It was exactly what they needed to hear. It absolved them of all their guilt, erased their terrible financial irresponsibility, and turned them into the concerned, heroic children, trying to save their sick father from a malicious legal predator. Garrett stood up straighter, his chest swelling as he latched on to the lie with desperate, pathetic relief. He declared that Delaney was an absolute genius. He stated that they were going to seize the entire estate and freeze Kessler completely out of the picture. Brendan pulled his phone back out of his pocket, but this time he was not calling a creditor. He told the group that he knew a very aggressive litigation attorney in the city who specialized in hostile family takeovers and aggressive estate law. Brendan dialed the number right there in the empty parking lot, pacing back and forth as he quickly and smoothly pitched their entirely fabricated story to the lawyer on the other end of the line. He claimed his father-in-law was suffering from advanced, undiagnosed dementia, exhibiting erratic, highly paranoid behavior, and was currently being financially isolated and abused by his longtime attorney. The plan was set into motion with terrifying speed. By mid-afternoon, the 4 of them were sitting in a sleek downtown law office, signing their names to a mountain of legal declarations. They swore under penalty of perjury that Everett was a danger to himself. They painted a heartbreaking, entirely fictional picture of an old man losing his grip on reality, building walls to keep away the family that loved him so dearly. They filed an aggressive emergency petition for full legal conservatorship. They demanded the court grant them immediate, unilateral control over the entire estate, all banking portals, and the power to instantly dismiss Kessler from all legal duties. They left the courthouse that afternoon, feeling incredibly powerful, completely convinced they had just outsmarted the master architect. They had set the hook, entirely unaware they were swimming directly into the final devastating trap. The late afternoon sun dipped below the tree line, casting long stretches of amber light across the hardwood floors of the study. Everett sat at his vintage drafting table, a piece of furniture he had not used seriously since his retirement. He was rolling a smooth graphite pencil between his fingers, staring down at a blank sheet of drafting paper. For decades, this table was where he solved problems. If a load-bearing wall was insufficient, he calculated the necessary reinforcements. If a foundation showed signs of settling, he designed a method to stabilize the earth beneath it. He was a man who fixed structural failures for a living. But as he looked at the empty white paper, he realized that some structures were simply beyond repair. Some things needed to be entirely demolished so the earth could be cleared for something new. The profound silence of the fortified estate was broken by the sharp, sudden ringing of the phone resting on his desk. Everett did not jump. He did not rush to answer it. He carefully placed the graphite pencil down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the drafting board. He walked over to the heavy oak desk and picked up the device. The caller identification displayed a single name, Kessler. Everett swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. He did not say hello. He simply waited, knowing exactly why the attorney was calling at this hour. "They took the bait, Everett," Kessler said, his voice coming through the receiver with a crisp, undeniable clarity. The lawyer sounded completely professional, but beneath the polished exterior, there was a distinct note of grim satisfaction. "They just filed an emergency petition for full legal conservatorship at the downtown courthouse. The ink on the paperwork is barely dry." Everett stood looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the impenetrable iron gates standing resolute at the bottom of his driveway. A slow, grim smile spread across his weathered face. It was not a smile of joy or triumph. It was the solemn expression of a man who had accurately predicted a devastating storm and was watching the rain finally begin to fall. "Read it to me, Kessler," Everett said, his voice steady and completely devoid of surprise. "Tell me exactly what my children swore under penalty of perjury." He heard the rustling of thick paper on the other end of the line. Kessler cleared his throat, preparing to recite the absolute fabrication the children had formally submitted to a judge. "They claim you are suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia, Everett. They stated under oath that you have been exhibiting highly erratic and dangerously paranoid behavior over the last 48 hours. They specifically cited the sudden installation of the security gates and the freezing of your assets as proof that you have completely lost your grip on reality." Everett let out a quiet, dry chuckle. It was a remarkably convenient narrative. In their entitled minds, holding them financially accountable was considered a clear symptom of a degenerative brain disease. "It gets better," Kessler continued, his tone dripping with professional disdain. "They did not just target your mental capacity. They targeted me. They formally accused me of elder abuse and financial manipulation. They told the court that I am taking advantage of a grieving, lonely old man, poisoning your mind against your loving family so I can slowly drain the estate trust for my own personal gain. They are petitioning for my immediate removal as your legal counsel and demanding unilateral control over every single asset you possess." Everett turned away from the window and walked back toward his desk. The sheer audacity of their lies was breathtaking, but it was exactly what he and Kessler had anticipated. They had cornered his children financially, and instead of reflecting on their own monumental failures, the kids had chosen the most aggressive, fraudulent path possible. They were trying to use the legal system as a weapon to steal the keys to the castle. "Are they requesting an emergency hearing?" Everett asked, leaning against the edge of the heavy oak desk. "Yes," Kessler replied quickly, "because they claimed you are a direct threat to your own financial well-being, and cited my supposed manipulation." The judge granted an expedited hearing. "We are scheduled to appear in court on Monday morning. They are going to stand up in front of a judge and try to strip away your basic human rights so they can pay for their luxury cars and failing businesses." Everett looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a builder, rough, calloused, and steady. He had used these hands to feed those children, to clothe them, to build the very roof they grew up under. Now those same children were trying to legally bind his hands so they could pick his pockets clean. The grief he had felt over the last few days evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. The final shred of his parental guilt vanished, leaving only the ruthless precision of an architect ready to execute a controlled demolition. "Kessler," Everett said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding frequency. "We gave them the rope, and they decided to tie the noose themselves. I want you to prepare the final set of documents." "You mean the medical files?" Kessler asked, confirming the strategy. "I mean everything," Everett clarified. "Have the chief of neurology send over the certified results of my cognitive exams from last month. Have the psychiatric evaluation clearly highlighted, showing that I am in the top percentile for mental acuity for my age group. I want those medical records bound and ready to submit to the judge the absolute second they finish telling their pathetic lies. Consider it done, Everett. I will have the medical defense completely bulletproof." "But what about the other matter?" Kessler paused, the weight of the upcoming request hanging heavy on the line. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with the commercial trust transfer? Once I file these deeds, there is no turning back. The estate and the surrounding land will be legally untouchable." Everett looked out the window one last time, gazing across the vast, rolling 50 acres of prime real estate that he had quietly owned for decades. He saw the empty fields where he was about to build a legacy that actually mattered. "I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life, Kessler," Everett replied, his tone absolute and unwavering. "Draft the transfer deeds. Move the 15-acre estate and the 50 commercial acres directly into the new architectural trust. Liquidate my personal ownership completely. When my children walk into that courtroom on Monday, expecting to seize an empire, I want you to be fully prepared to show them that the empire no longer exists." "Understood, Everett," Kessler said, a rare hint of admiration warming his usually gruff voice. "I will have the final documents ready for your signature by tomorrow afternoon. Enjoy your weekend. It is going to be a very interesting Monday." Everett ended the call and placed the phone back on the desk. He walked over to the drafting table and picked up his graphite pencil. He did not feel tired. He did not feel old. He felt a surge of profound, revitalizing energy. He placed the tip of the pencil against the blank paper and began to draw the very first sharp, unyielding line of his brand-new foundation. Monday morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky hanging low over the city, but the gloomy weather did absolutely nothing to dampen the bright, triumphant spirits of the four people striding up the wide concrete steps of the downtown courthouse. Garrett, Sabrina, Delaney, and Brendan moved together in a tight, arrogant formation. They did not look like a family, burdened by the tragic mental decline of their beloved patriarch. They looked exactly like an executive board preparing to celebrate a highly lucrative corporate takeover. Every single detail of their appearance had been meticulously curated to project quiet, tasteful wealth and profound respectability. Garrett wore a bespoke navy suit that cost well over $3,000, a suit paid for entirely by the monthly allowance he had just lost. Delaney walked beside him, draped in pristine, high-end fabrics, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. Sabrina and Brendan looked equally polished, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable arrogance. They were entirely convinced they had already won. Inside the echoing marble hallway, just outside the probate courtroom, they gathered in a small circle to rehearse their performance one final time. Delaney leaned in close, her voice a hushed, conspiratorial whisper, as she reminded Garrett to soften his tone when addressing the judge. She instructed him to look heartbroken and reluctant rather than angry or eager. Sabrina practiced her role perfectly, pulling a folded tissue from her purse and lightly dabbing at the corners of her dry eyes. They were treating the systematic destruction of their father's independence as nothing more than a minor theatrical production. They spoke in rapid, excited whispers about the immediate future, discussing exactly what they would do the very second the judge handed them the legal keys to the sprawling 15-acre estate. Garrett muttered that he would have the banking portals unlocked by noon, allowing him to push his bounced payroll through before his employees quit. Sabrina whispered that she would personally supervise the sale of the property, while Brendan confidently assured them that Kessler would be legally barred from the premises before lunch. The bailiff opened the heavy wooden doors and called the courtroom to order. The four of them walked down the center aisle and took their seats at the petitioner table, moving with a quiet, practiced solemnity. The courtroom was vast and quiet, filled with the heavy scent of old wood and floor wax. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense man with decades of experience on the bench, sat high above them, shuffling through the thick stack of emergency filings. Garrett leaned forward, resting his elbows on the long table. His face immediately dropped into a mask of profound, manufactured sorrow. He shook his head slowly, whispering to his expensive litigation attorney, playing the part of the devastated son who had been forced by tragic circumstances to take drastic legal measures against his own beloved father. Sabrina joined in the sickening charade seamlessly. She let out a soft, audible sniffle, pressing the tissue against her nose. She wanted the judge to look down from the bench and see exactly how much this terrible situation was hurting her. Brendan sat stoically beside her, putting a comforting, heavy arm around her shoulders, projecting the flawless image of a supportive, deeply concerned son-in-law. They were entirely convinced that their fabricated paperwork and their emotional performance were absolutely bulletproof. They fully believed the false narrative they had invented about a frail, paranoid, dementia-riddled old man was the only reality that mattered inside this room. Then the heavy double doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a deep, resonant thud. The sudden sound instantly cut through the quiet murmur of the legal proceedings, causing heads to turn. Garrett, Sabrina, Delaney, and Brendan shifted in their seats, looking back over their shoulders. They fully expected to see a frail, confused, shuffling old man being wheeled down the aisle or guided gently by a court-appointed health advocate. They expected to see the broken, paranoid victim they had so vividly described in their fraudulent legal petition. Instead, Everett walked through the doors. The air in the room seemed to shift immediately, pulled toward the commanding presence of the man stepping over the threshold. He was not shuffling. He was not confused. He walked with the rigid, perfectly balanced posture of a master architect who knew exactly how to command a room. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie knotted sharply at his collar. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his jaw was set firmly, and his eyes burned with an intense, absolute clarity. He looked sharper, stronger, and more overwhelmingly lucid than he had in over a decade. The fragile, dementia-riddled ghost they had described in their sworn legal filings simply did not exist. Everett stopped for a fraction of a second at the back of the center aisle, locking his piercing gaze directly onto his son and his daughter. He did not look angry or afraid. He looked at them with the cold, assessing gaze of a judge who had already heard the evidence and decided the sentence. Walking in perfect lockstep right beside him was Kessler. The veteran attorney moved like an apex predator, sensing blood in the water. He wore a charcoal pinstriped suit and an expression of supreme, predatory confidence. In his right hand, Kessler carried a massive, thick leather briefcase. The bag looked incredibly heavy, its seams bulging with the weight of the meticulously prepared, devastating truth. The briefcase did not contain desperate pleas for mercy or emotional family defenses. It contained the absolute, undeniable proof of multiple felonies. As Everett and Kessler strode purposefully down the center aisle toward the defense table, the smug, arrogant smiles on the faces of the children faltered for a fleeting. The polished veneer of their performance began to crack. Garrett felt a cold bead of sweat form at the base of his neck, sliding slowly down his spine. Sabrina lowered her tissue, her manufactured tears instantly drying up as she stared in open-mouthed shock at the imposing, unyielding figure of her father. He did not look like a man who needed a conservator to manage his life. He looked exactly like a man who was about to execute a flawless, merciless demolition of theirs. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom remained perfectly still as the judge called the first witness to the stand. Garrett stood up from the petitioner table, adjusting the cuffs of his $3,000 Navy suit. He walked toward the witness box with a slow, deliberate pace, attempting to project the image of a deeply reluctant, heartbroken son. He placed his right hand on the holy book, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. He looked up at the judge with wide, sorrowful eyes, carefully masking the desperate financial panic that was screaming just beneath the surface of his tailored exterior. His expensive litigation attorney stood up and gently guided Garrett through his rehearsed testimony. Garrett spoke in a soft, remarkably measured voice. He told the judge that his father, Everett, had been suffering from profound isolation since the tragic passing of his mother, Corinne, 5 years ago. Garrett claimed that over the last 48 hours, this quiet grief had suddenly, violently mutated into severe paranoid delusions. He described driving up to his childhood home only to find it barricaded behind massive, newly installed iron gates. He painted a terrifying picture of his father hiring a private tactical security force to physically expel his own loving family from the premises. Garrett leaned forward, gripping the edges of the witness stand to emphasize his fabricated distress. He testified that his father had completely lost his grip on reality. He stated that Everett had erratically frozen all the family bank accounts without any warning or logical reason. Garrett told the judge that his father was clearly suffering from advanced cognitive decline, unable to understand basic technology or manage his own substantial estate. He subtly shifted his gaze toward Kessler, painting the veteran lawyer as a malicious predator who was actively manipulating a sick, confused old man for personal financial gain. Garrett finished his direct testimony by lowering his head, looking like a man completely shattered by his father's tragic mental decay. The courtroom was silent for a long, heavy moment. Then Kessler slowly stood up from the defense table. He did not rush. He did not look angry. He walked to the center of the room, carrying a single, thin manila folder. He looked at Garrett with the cold, absolute precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. Kessler began his cross-examination with a very quiet, almost conversational tone. He asked Garrett to clarify a specific point regarding the frozen bank accounts. Kessler asked if the accounts that were locked were Garrett's personal corporate accounts, or if they were in fact private trust accounts solely owned and funded by Everett. Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his wooden chair. He cleared his throat, attempting to maintain his calm facade. He answered that they were joint family accounts used for estate management. Kessler did not let the evasion slide. He opened the folder and read from a bank statement. He asked Garrett to confirm that exactly $12,000 had been transferred from Everett to Garrett and his sister every single month for the past 3 years. Garrett swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat forming at his temple. He stammered that his father was simply helping with general family expenses. Kessler took a step closer to the witness box. His voice grew slightly louder, echoing off the marble walls. He asked Garrett if it was true that without his father's monthly charity, Garrett's technology consulting firm had completely missed payroll this past Friday morning. Garrett instantly turned a deep, blotchy red. His litigation attorney jumped up and objected, claiming relevance, but the judge overruled him, leaning forward with sudden, intense interest. Garrett was forced to answer. He muttered a barely audible confirmation. Kessler smiled, a cold, shark-like expression. He asked Garrett if it was possible that his father was not suffering from paranoid delusions at all. Kessler suggested that perhaps Everett had simply realized his son was a 38-year-old man running a bankrupt company and decided to permanently close the bank. Garrett gripped the railing of the stand, his knuckles turning white as his perfectly constructed narrative began to unravel under oath. He tried to argue, but Kessler simply thanked him and dismissed him from the stand, leaving Garrett entirely humiliated in front of the judge. Sabrina was called to the stand next. She practically floated to the witness box, her face a masterclass in theatrical tragedy. She clutched a fresh white tissue in her trembling hands, taking her seat with a dramatic, helpless sigh. When her attorney began asking questions, Sabrina immediately burst into soft, practiced tears. She cried that she just wanted her dad to be safe. She spun a vivid, emotional tale about arriving at the estate to check on his failing health, only to be terrified by armed guards. She claimed her father was a prisoner in his own home, confused and frightened by the modern world. She looked directly at the judge, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. She begged the court to grant them the conservatorship so she could rescue her father from his own deteriorating mind. She claimed that freezing the accounts was proof that he no longer understood how to pay his own bills or manage his daily life. She painted herself as the ultimate devoted daughter, willing to take on the massive burden of managing the sprawling estate solely out of pure, unconditional love. Kessler approached the witness stand for his second cross-examination. He did not offer Sabrina any gentle pleasantries. He immediately asked her about her country club membership. Sabrina blinked, her fake tears instantly halting as pure confusion washed over her face. She asked what her social club had to do with her father's failing health. Kessler informed the court that Sabrina and her husband, Brendan, were currently carrying over $90,000 in high-interest credit card debt. He read aloud from a financial disclosure, proving that her luxury utility vehicle was currently 3 months behind on lease payments and had been flagged for repossession on the exact same morning she claimed she went to check on her father. Sabrina opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The elegant, sophisticated image she had projected just moments ago completely shattered. Kessler did not stop. He asked Sabrina if she drove to the estate on Friday morning because she was genuinely worried about her father and his mental state, or if she drove up there because her platinum card had just been declined in front of her wealthy friends. He asked her if she wanted the conservatorship to protect Everett, or if she desperately needed the legal authority to liquidate his property before her own creditors destroyed her life. Sabrina turned bright red, her voice pitching into a shrill, defensive shriek. She yelled that Kessler was twisting the facts and manipulating the court. She screamed that she was entitled to that money because she was the daughter, and her father owed them a certain standard of living. The sudden explosive outburst echoed through the silent courtroom. She had entirely dropped the act of the weeping, concerned child, revealing the vicious, greedy entitlement burning underneath. The judge stared down at Sabrina with an expression of profound, visible disgust. The narrative of the frail, paranoid father had been completely dismantled. Kessler had masterfully exposed the children not as loving caretakers, but as desperate, bankrupt adults trying to legally rob the man who had funded their entire lives. Everett sat silently at the defense table, watching his children squirm under the crushing weight of their own exposed lies. The trap had been perfectly executed, and the final devastating blow was still waiting inside Kessler's heavy leather briefcase. The courtroom was still buzzing with the chaotic aftermath of Sabrina's shrill, defensive outburst. The judge struck his wooden gavel sharply against the sounding block, demanding absolute silence. He glared down at the petitioner table, where the four of them sat, completely frozen. Their polished performance was entirely in ruins. Kessler stood in the center of the room, perfectly calm, absorbing the palpable fear radiating from the children. He addressed the judge with a smooth, resonant voice, stating that the defense was now ready to present its primary evidence. Kessler walked back to the heavy leather briefcase, resting on the defense table. He popped the brass latches open, the sharp, metallic click echoing loudly in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a pristine white folder. He approached the bench and handed the documents up to the judge. Kessler explained that the court had been presented with a harrowing fictional tale of a man suffering from severe cognitive decline. To address this blatant fabrication, Kessler submitted comprehensive neurological and psychiatric evaluations, completed just 48 hours prior, by the chief of neurology at the state medical board. Kessler paced slowly in front of the witness stand, projecting his voice so every single person in the gallery could hear him clearly. He summarized the medical findings with surgical precision. The reports confirmed that Everett was not only completely free of any degenerative brain diseases, but he scored in the 99th percentile for mental acuity, spatial reasoning, and cognitive processing for his age group. The presiding psychiatrist had formally noted that Everett was remarkably lucid, sharp, and possessed an extraordinary capacity for complex problem-solving. He was not a fragile, paranoid victim. He was a highly functional master architect operating at the peak of his mental faculties. The judge spent several long minutes reading through the certified medical documents. He adjusted his glasses, flipping from page to page, his expression darkening with every paragraph. The legal threshold for a conservatorship required undeniable proof of mental incompetence. The medical files in his hands proved the exact opposite. He looked down at Garrett and Sabrina, his eyes narrowing with a fierce judicial anger. He bluntly informed their litigation attorney that the medical evidence completely contradicted their sworn emergency petition. Garrett sank lower in his chair, feeling the walls of the courtroom closing in around him. Delaney gripped his forearm, her fingernails digging painfully into his expensive tailored suit. They had banked everything on the assumption that a judge would simply look at an old man and believe the worst. They had never anticipated that Everett would proactively secure airtight medical defense records. But the destruction of their false narrative was only the beginning. Kessler had simply cleared the brush. Now he was preparing to detonate the foundation. Kessler returned to his briefcase and pulled out a second, much thicker folder. This one was bound in thick red cardstock. He walked back to the center of the courtroom, holding the red folder up so the children could see it clearly. He addressed the judge, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. He stated that the court had just witnessed a desperate attempt to strip a perfectly healthy man of his fundamental human rights. Kessler asked the judge a simple, profound question. Why would four wealthy, successful young adults commit perjury to seize control of an estate they were already destined to inherit? Kessler did not wait for the opposing counsel to object. He immediately provided the answer. He declared that this petition for conservatorship had absolutely nothing to do with medical care, isolation, or a father pushing his children away. He stated with absolute, booming clarity that the children filed this emergency petition for one single reason. They were desperately trying to cover up their tracks after committing massive felony wire fraud against their own father. The word fraud hung in the stagnant air of the courtroom like a physical weight. Sabrina gasped audibly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Garrett turned the color of ash. Brendan physically pushed his chair back from the table, as if trying to distance himself from the explosion that was actively occurring. Their high-priced litigation attorney looked absolutely bewildered, frantically whispering to Garrett, demanding to know what Kessler was talking about. Garrett could not formulate a response. His throat was completely dry. His heart was hammering against his ribs so violently he thought it might shatter his chest. Kessler approached the bench and handed the thick red folder to the judge. He then turned to face the gallery, systematically dismantling the entire timeline of events. He explained that 3 days ago, on the evening of his 71st birthday, Everett logged into his secure private banking portal. Kessler stated that Everett did not find a confusing technological interface. He found a highly suspicious critical security alert regarding the deed to his 15-acre estate. Kessler walked the judge through the documents line by agonizing line. He revealed the commercial bridge loan application. It was a formal request to borrow $500,000, using the entire unencumbered estate as absolute collateral. The funds were directed to be immediately dispersed into an offshore holding account, managed jointly by Garrett and Sabrina. Kessler pointed to the final page of the application, highlighting the digital signatures. He explained that the children had intentionally bypassed their father's primary email address, rerouted the secure verification codes, and forged his digital signature with chilling precision. The judge flipped to the back of the file, his face turning a deep, mottled red. He was an officer of the law who despised being used as a pawn in a criminal scheme. He stared at the digital logs that Kessler had thoughtfully provided. Kessler proudly announced that the Cybersecurity Division had tracked the Internet Protocol addresses attached to the fraudulent loan submission. The digital footprint did not trace back to the Hudson Valley estate. It traced directly to the primary server inside Garrett's corporate technology office in the city. The timestamps proved the application was submitted, while Everett was sitting alone at his dining room table, waiting for his children to arrive for his birthday dinner. The truth was absolutely devastating. Kessler tied the entire chaotic narrative together into one neat, horrifying package. He looked directly at the children and explained their true motive to the court. He stated that Everett did not freeze their accounts and build a security gate because he was paranoid. Everett built the gate because he caught them trying to steal the very roof over his head. The children did not file for conservatorship because they loved him. They filed the emergency petition because the Bank Fraud Division flagged the forged loan, and they needed unilateral legal control over the estate to force the paperwork through before the federal authorities could be notified. They needed to declare their father legally incompetent so they could seize the deed, sign the final authorizations themselves, and bury their federal crimes under the guise of estate management. They were trying to use the gavel of this very court to finalize a $500,000 theft. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. The air had been completely sucked out of the room. Garrett rested his head in his hands, realizing with crystal clarity that he was not going back to his luxury apartment today. He was looking at federal prison. Sabrina was quietly hyperventilating, her pristine socialite image entirely obliterated. Brendan and Delaney pushed their chairs away from the table, physically distancing themselves from the two siblings, trying desperately to save themselves from the sinking ship. The judge slowly closed the red folder. The sharp slap of the cardboard echoed like a gunshot. He looked down at the petitioner table with a gaze so filled with judicial fury it made the litigation attorney physically flinch. The elaborate disguise of the caring, wealthy children had been entirely stripped away. They were completely exposed, not as concerned family members, but as ruthless, desperate criminals who had been caught red-handed. Everett remained seated at the defense table, perfectly calm, perfectly silent, watching the ultimate destruction of the entitled monsters he had accidentally created. The foundation they had built their arrogant lives upon had just been completely demolished, and there was absolutely nothing left but the rubble. The silence in the courtroom stretched out for an agonizing length of time. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed down on the shoulders of everyone present. The judge sat high upon his elevated bench, staring down at the thick red folder containing the undeniable proof of my children's absolute treachery. When he finally looked up, the expression on his face was one of pure, unfiltered judicial disgust. He took off his reading glasses and folded them slowly, deliberately, placing them next to his wooden gavel. He did not look at Garrett or Sabrina first. He locked his furious gaze directly onto their highly paid litigation attorney. The judge leaned forward, his voice echoing through the vast marble room with the force of a thunderclap. He asked the attorney in a dangerously quiet tone if he made it a habit to use this court to facilitate $500,000 federal fraud schemes. The attorney completely lost whatever slick corporate composure he had possessed just moments earlier. He stood up so fast, his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. He threw his hands up in the air, aggressively shaking his head and stammering that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of any forged loan documents. The lawyer frantically began shoving his pristine legal pads and expensive pens into his briefcase, physically backing away from the petitioner table. He practically shouted that his clients had lied to him, and he formally requested to immediately withdraw as their legal counsel. The judge granted this withdrawal with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. The attorney turned on his heel and practically ran down the center aisle, leaving Garrett and Sabrina entirely abandoned to face the consequences of their actions. With the lawyer gone, the judge turned his absolute wrath upon my children. He leaned over the polished mahogany bench, his voice dripping with profound contempt. He stated that in his 30 years of presiding over probate and estate law, he had seen families tear each other apart over money, but he had rarely witnessed something as fundamentally despicable as this. He told Garrett and Sabrina that they had not only attempted to rob their grieving father of his home and his financial security, but they had shamelessly attempted to strip away his human dignity in the process. They had sat in his courtroom and weaponized the legal system, attempting to declare a perfectly healthy, lucid man incompetent solely to bury a massive financial crime. Garrett sat completely paralyzed. He stared blankly at the judge, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The polished, successful entrepreneur facade had completely melted away, leaving only a terrified, bankrupt man staring down the barrel of a ruined life. Sabrina was no longer crying fake theatrical tears for sympathy. She was violently sobbing from a place of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she realized her country club friends and her elite social circles would soon be reading about her attempted felony fraud. Brendan and Delaney sat rigidly beside them, their faces drained of all color. They had walked into the courthouse expecting a coronation, and were now actively realizing they were tied to two individuals facing serious criminal exposure. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He announced that he was dismissing the emergency petition for conservatorship with extreme prejudice. He stated clearly for the official court record that I was entirely competent to manage my own affairs, and that the petitioners had acted with malicious, fraudulent intent. But the judge was not finished. He pointed the heavy handle of his gavel directly at Garrett. He warned my son that the Federal Bank Fraud Division took forged commercial bridge loans incredibly seriously. The judge explicitly stated that Garrett and Sabrina were exceptionally lucky that Kessler had not yet forwarded the digital footprint and the forged documents to the federal prosecutor. He promised them that if they ever attempted to file another petition in his courthouse, he would personally oversee their criminal indictment. He slammed the gavel down onto the sounding block. The sharp, loud crack signaled the absolute, permanent end of their legal manipulation. The courtroom remained perfectly still, even after the official ruling. Nobody moved. The gallery spectators simply stared at the four thoroughly humiliated figures sitting at the petitioner table. The sheer magnitude of their defeat was absolute. They had absolutely nothing left. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their credit lines were exhausted. Their legal counsel had abandoned them. Their reputations were completely obliterated. They had walked into the room demanding an empire, and they were leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the terrifying threat of a looming federal investigation. I sat at the defense table, feeling a profound, unwavering sense of peace. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the sobbing woman or the trembling man sitting across the aisle. Corinne had been right all along. I had spent my entire life shielding them from the harsh reality of consequences, and they had responded by trying to destroy me. Now they were finally feeling the full, crushing weight of their own terrible choices. I had built the wall they needed to hit, and they had crashed into it at full speed. I placed my hands flat against the mahogany table and slowly stood up. I buttoned my tailored suit jacket, moving with careful, deliberate precision. The sound of my movement drew the attention of the entire room. Garrett slowly raised his head, looking at me through terrified, bloodshot eyes. Sabrina let out a soft, pathetic whimper, shrinking back into her heavy wooden chair. They looked at me like cornered animals, waiting for the final blow to fall. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to establish my authority. I looked directly at my children, projecting my voice just loud enough to cut through their quiet sobbing. I told them that the judge had spared them a prison cell today, but our business was not yet concluded. I looked at Brendan and Delaney, ensuring they understood they were equally responsible for this massive betrayal. I told all four of them to gather their things and stand up. I instructed them to walk down the center aisle and step outside onto the courthouse steps. I told them I had one final announcement to make, and that they were going to listen to every single word. I turned away from their terrified faces and began walking toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. Kessler fell into step right beside me, carrying his massive leather briefcase. I did not look back to see if they were following. I knew they would. They had absolutely no other choice. They were completely broken, stripped of all their power, and utterly desperate to know if I was going to send them to federal prison. They were going to follow me out into the gray, overcast morning, and I was going to deliver the final devastating piece of my architectural masterpiece. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us, leaving the stifling tension of the legal proceedings inside. We walked out into the vast, echoing marble corridor of the courthouse. The cold air of the hallway hit my face, but I felt incredibly warm and remarkably calm. I walked slowly, deliberately, listening to the frantic, scrambling footsteps echoing behind me. Garrett and Sabrina were practically tripping over themselves to catch up. Their polished, arrogant corporate demeanors had been entirely stripped away by the judge's ruling, leaving nothing but raw, pathetic desperation in their wake. Garrett grabbed my arm, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He begged me to stop, his voice cracking loudly in the cavernous hallway. He swore that he never meant for things to go this far, and pleaded that the forged commercial loan was just a temporary bridge. He desperately tried to convince me it was a simple mistake made by a panicked man trying to save his struggling tech company. He cried that he was facing federal prison and total, absolute bankruptcy, begging his father to please just call off the lawyers and fix the massive mess he had created. Sabrina pushed her way forward, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. This time, the tears were completely real. She grabbed my other arm, sobbing that her entire social life was destroyed, that her luxury cars were actively being repossessed, and that she would do absolutely anything I asked if I just restored her monthly allowance. She pleaded for a second chance, promising to be the devoted, caring daughter I had always wanted her to be. I stood perfectly still and looked at the two children I had raised. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy or paternal warmth. Before I could even speak, the fragile alliance between the four of them completely and violently imploded. Brendan stepped forward, his face flushed with furious, burning resentment. He pointed a shaking finger at Garrett and Sabrina, loudly declaring to anyone in the hallway that he had absolutely nothing to do with the forged loan documents. He screamed that his wife and his brother-in-law were reckless, greedy fools who had dragged an innocent man into a massive federal crime. Delaney immediately joined the chaotic screaming match. She yelled at Garrett, demanding a divorce, right there on the marble floor. She cried that she refused to be legally tied to a bankrupt felon and lose her pristine social standing over his staggering incompetence. They stood in a circle, viciously tearing each other apart like desperate, starving animals, fighting over the last remaining scraps. I watched their toxic, chaotic display for a long moment, absorbing the true nature of their character. The absolute second the free money disappeared, they turned on each other with ruthless hostility. I did not raise my voice. I simply cleared my throat, making a single sharp sound that instantly silenced their vicious arguing. They all turned to look at me, their eyes wide with desperate, lingering hope. They were still waiting for the master architect to step in and rebuild their shattered lives. I looked at Garrett and told him that his apologies were entirely hollow and meaningless. I told Sabrina that her tears were nothing more than the sheer panic of a spoiled child losing her allowance. I calmly explained that they did not regret trying to steal my home and my security. They only regretted getting caught. I told them I was not going to send them to federal prison, because watching them live in the ruins of their own terrible financial decisions was a far more appropriate and lasting punishment. Garrett let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He actually tried to smile, wiping the sweat from his forehead and thanking me profusely. He wrongly assumed that avoiding a federal prison cell meant the bank accounts would magically unlock. He took a step closer and told me that we could go back to the estate, sit down over a nice dinner, and figure out a proper financial transition together. I shook my head slowly, shattering that final delusion. I told Garrett we were not going anywhere together. I looked at Kessler, who was standing quietly by my side, observing the wreckage. I gave him a slight nod. Kessler unlatched his heavy leather briefcase one final time. He reached inside and pulled out a single, neatly bound legal document printed on thick premium paper. He handed the document directly to Garrett. Sabrina, Brendan, and Delaney immediately crowded around him, their eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. I watched the very last remaining shreds of their hope evaporate as they read the first page. Garrett looked up at me, his face completely devoid of color. His jaw trembled as he asked me what this document was, his voice dropping to a terrified, breathy whisper. I spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity, ensuring every single word landed with devastating precision. I told them they had spent their entire lives assuming they were the sole heirs to my 15-acre estate. I revealed that what they never knew, because they never bothered to ask about my life or my career, was that I also owned the commercial zoning rights to the surrounding 50 acres of prime real estate. I watched their eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated shock as they realized I had been sitting on a massive hidden fortune for over 2 decades. They thought they were stealing a single custom house, but they had completely missed an entire empire. I explained that exactly 48 hours ago, while they were frantically trying to forge my signature on a fraudulent bridge loan, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, executing a flawless legal transfer. I told them that the 15-acre estate, the custom-built house, and the surrounding 50 acres of commercial land no longer belonged to me personally. I had legally sold every single inch of the property to a commercial trust that I completely control. The inheritance they had tried so desperately to steal simply did not exist anymore. It was completely gone, liquidated, and transferred out of their greedy reach forever. Sabrina dropped her designer purse onto the hard marble floor, the loud thud echoing down the corridor. She stared at me in total disbelief, her voice shaking, as she asked what I was going to do with all that land and all that money. I smiled. It was the first genuine feeling of joy I had experienced in 5 long years. I told them that I was finally fixing my greatest architectural mistake. I explained that the commercial trust was actively funding the total demolition of the massive empty house they tried to steal. In its place, I was building a state-of-the-art architectural academy for underprivileged youth. I was building a massive modern campus where hardworking students could learn to design and construct real, sturdy foundations. And on the surrounding 50 acres, I was developing a beautifully designed affordable housing project for families who actually understood the value of hard work and gratitude. I told them I was not just liquidating my assets despite them. I was using the wealth they felt so intensely entitled to in order to build a legacy that actually mattered. I was giving my fortune to complete strangers, because those strangers possessed far more integrity, more drive, and more honor than my own flesh and blood. Garrett stared blindly at the legal document in his trembling hands. The staggering, suffocating weight of his loss finally crushed him. He had traded a massive multi-million-dollar kingdom for a fraudulent $500,000 loan, and he had ended up with absolutely nothing. Delaney let out a quiet, devastated sob, realizing her luxurious, carefree lifestyle was permanently over. Brendan stared blankly at the floor, completely defeated and entirely humiliated. I told them they had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable wallet. I explained that they had mistaken my quiet grief for weakness and my endless generosity for stupidity. I looked at the four of them, standing in the cold hallway, completely bankrupt, publicly exposed, and legally powerless. I told them they were finally completely free to live their own lives exactly as they had demanded on my birthday call. I advised them to learn how to budget quickly, because the master architect had officially closed the bank, and there would never be another deposit. I looked at the four of them standing in the cold hallway, completely bankrupt, publicly exposed, and legally powerless. The absolute terror in their eyes was no longer something I felt compelled to fix. For 38 years, I had stepped in front of every consequence they ever faced. I had paid the debts. I had smoothed over the failures. I had allowed them to believe that their arrogant, reckless behavior was simply the privilege of their birthright. But looking at Garrett and Sabrina, now stripped of their unearned wealth and facing the stark, unforgiving reality of the world, I felt a profound sense of absolute finality. I took one step closer to them, ensuring that my voice was the only thing they could focus on. I told Garrett that his failed companies and his bounced payrolls were no longer my problem to subsidize. I told Sabrina that her desperate need to impress wealthy strangers was a heavy burden she would now carry entirely alone. I looked directly into their wide, panicked eyes, watching the last remnants of their entitlement completely evaporate. "You wanted your own lives," I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly down the marble corridor. "You have them. Your debts are yours. Your failures are yours. I am no longer your safety net." I did not wait for their responses. I did not want to hear their desperate wailing or their hollow, empty promises of change. I simply turned my back on them and began walking down the long, echoing corridor toward the main exit of the courthouse. Kessler fell into step right beside me, his heavy leather briefcase swinging slightly with his stride. I pushed open the massive brass doors, stepping out onto the wide concrete steps of the courthouse. The gray, overcast sky had finally broken, and a cold, crisp wind was sweeping through the downtown streets. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, feeling lighter than I had in decades. The enormous, crushing weight of trying to save people who actively wanted to destroy me was completely gone. I walked down the concrete steps with the steady, balanced stride of a man who had finally set his own house in order. I could hear the frantic, heavy footsteps of my children bursting through the courthouse doors right behind us, but I did not slow down, and I absolutely did not turn around. Out on the wide concrete steps, the desperate silence was violently shattered by Delaney. The pristine, polished socialite facade she had maintained for years completely vanished, replaced by a shrill, terrifying scream of pure panic. She realized with brutal clarity that the luxury lifestyle she had married into was permanently gone. The offshore accounts were empty. The sprawling estate was transferred into a commercial trust. The limitless fountain of cash was dead. She turned on Garrett, her face contorted with a vicious, unforgiving rage. She screamed that he was a pathetic, incompetent failure who had dragged her down into a massive federal fraud investigation. She grabbed her expensive designer handbag and hurled it directly at his chest, hitting him with a loud, dull thud. Garrett tried to reach for her, stammering and begging her to calm down, promising her that he could call a bankruptcy lawyer and somehow figure a way out of the mess. Delaney slapped his hands away, completely disgusted by his weakness. She yelled that she was packing her things and filing for divorce, before the federal authorities could freeze whatever meager personal assets she had left. She turned on her heel, her high heels clicking aggressively against the concrete, and marched down the steps, leaving her husband totally abandoned. The contagion of absolute betrayal spread instantly to Sabrina and Brendan. Brendan completely ignored his collapsing marriage, focusing all of his intense managerial fury onto his wife. He pointed a shaking finger right in Sabrina's face, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. He screamed that her staggering incompetence had destroyed his entire life. He yelled that the leasing company was probably towing their luxury utility vehicles right out of the courthouse parking lot at this very second. He reminded her that their country club friends were going to read about this humiliating public spectacle, and they would be completely blacklisted from every elite social circle in the county. Sabrina collapsed onto the hard, cold concrete steps, weeping with a loud, gut-wrenching despair. She begged Brendan to stop yelling at her, clutching at his suit jacket and pleading for him to tell her what they were going to do to survive the weekend. Brendan ripped his jacket out of her desperate grip, his face flushed purple with anger. He told her she was going to have to find a minimum wage job and figure out how to pay off $90,000 in high-interest credit card debt entirely on her own. I reached the bottom of the long staircase, where a sleek black town car was idling by the curb, waiting for me and Kessler. The driver respectfully opened the rear passenger door. Before I stepped inside the warm, quiet interior of the vehicle, I paused. I turned around and looked up the massive flight of concrete steps one last time. It was a pathetic, tragic spectacle. The four adults who had walked into the courthouse, projecting an aura of untouchable arrogance and supreme wealth, were now completely turning on each other, like starved, vicious animals. Garrett was sitting on the steps, with his head buried in his hands, his business ruined, his wife gone, and his freedom hanging by a very thin legal thread. Sabrina was sobbing loudly on the dirty concrete, begging a furious, screaming Brendan not to leave her alone to face the massive debts they had racked up together. They were tearing each other apart, right there in the cold gray morning, entirely consumed by the devastating consequences of their own bottomless greed. The foundation they had built their entire lives upon was made of nothing but lies and stolen money. Now that the foundation had been completely pulverized, the entire structure was collapsing inward, crushing them under the sheer weight of their own terrible choices. They were finally experiencing the real harsh world, without a single dime of my money to shield them. I watched them fight for a few more seconds, feeling completely detached from their suffering. I turned around, slid into the comfortable leather seat of the town car, and told the driver to take us home. 6 months passed. The blistering cold of winter had slowly melted away, giving rise to a crisp, bright spring. But the changing seasons brought absolutely no warmth to the harsh, brutal reality my children were now forced to endure. Inside a cramped, windowless office building on the outskirts of the city, Garrett sat hunched over a cheap laminate desk. He was no longer wearing his $3,000 bespoke Navy suits. Those had been liquidated months ago to pay off a fraction of his staggering corporate debt. Instead, he wore a faded gray button-down shirt that frayed slightly at the collar. A heavy headset was strapped tightly over his ears, pinning him to his small, isolated cubicle. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable tech visionary, pitching bloated startup ideas to wealthy investors in glass boardrooms. He was an entry-level sales representative, cold-calling angry customers to sell discounted office supplies. He stared blankly at the glowing spreadsheet on his monitor, his eyes bloodshot and heavy, with profound physical exhaustion. The aggressive voice of his regional manager barked over the intercom, demanding higher call volumes and threatening immediate termination for anyone who missed their daily quota. Garrett flinched at the sharp sound. For 38 years he had never answered to anyone. He had never feared losing his livelihood because his father had always been standing right behind him with an open checkbook, ready to catch him the absolute second he stumbled. Now there was no safety net. There was only the relentless, grueling pressure of scraping together barely enough money to make his minimum monthly rent payments. He picked up his headset, taking a slow, shuddering breath, and dialed the next number on his list. His voice cracked as he launched into his scripted sales pitch, swallowing his pride completely as the customer on the other end of the line rudely hung up on him. Garrett closed his eyes and buried his face in his rough, calloused hands, experiencing the crushing, unforgiving weight of the real world. For the very first time in his entire life, he finally understood that building something real required actual sweat, and not just empty, arrogant promises. Miles away, in a rundown neighborhood that her former country club friends would not even drive through, Sabrina was experiencing her own spectacular fall from grace. She sat alone at a scratched, wobbly kitchen table inside a tiny one-bedroom apartment. The sprawling manicured lawns and heated swimming pools she had grown so accustomed to were completely gone, replaced by the loud rumbling of the elevated train tracks just outside her thin, rattling window. Brendan was gone too. The absolute second the money vanished and the high-interest debt collectors began circling, their marriage completely imploded. He had packed his bags and abandoned her, leaving Sabrina to face the devastating consequences of their lavish lifestyle entirely on her own. She looked down at the stack of past-due utility bills spread out across the cheap table. She held a basic plastic pen in her trembling hand, trying desperately to calculate how she was going to afford groceries for the rest of the week. Her pristine luxury utility vehicle had been repossessed months ago, seized aggressively from a public parking lot while she watched in total humiliation. She now relied on a worn-out bus pass to get across town to her new job, working as a junior receptionist at a low-tier commercial real estate firm. The commute was long and physically draining, forcing her to stand in the freezing rain and wait alongside the everyday working people she used to openly mock. The very same women she used to look down upon at her elite social gatherings were now the demanding clients she was forced to serve coffee to. The humiliation burned fiercely in her chest every single day, but she had absolutely no choice. She carefully placed her pen down and looked around the cramped, dimly lit room, feeling the walls closing in on her. The silence of the small apartment was suffocating and entirely unfamiliar. There were no extravagant parties to attend, no expensive dinners to post about, and absolutely no father to rescue her from her own poor decisions. Sabrina finally understood the true value of $1, because for the very first time she was actually forced to earn one. While my children were finally learning how to survive the harsh reality they had so aggressively demanded, I walked slowly through the quiet, peaceful grounds of the local cemetery. The morning air was crisp and fresh, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. I carried a simple, beautiful bouquet of white lilies in my right hand, moving with a steady, balanced stride. I did not feel the heavy, crushing sorrow that used to accompany these visits. I felt a profound, undeniable sense of absolute clarity and deep, abiding peace. I reached the familiar marble headstone resting beneath the shade of a massive ancient oak tree. I gently knelt down and placed the white lilies against the smooth, cool stone, tracing my fingers over the beautifully engraved letters of Corinne's name. I took a deep breath, letting the absolute tranquility of the cemetery wash over me completely. I looked at the headstone and began to speak, my voice low, steady, and filled with an overwhelming sense of closure. I told her that she had been completely right all along. I confessed that my endless generosity had been nothing more than a selfish desire to be the hero in their lives, completely ignoring the terrible structural damage it was causing to their character. I told my beautiful, pragmatic wife that I had finally fixed my greatest architectural mistake. I explained to her that a strong building cannot stand on a foundation of unearned privilege and endless bailouts. It requires the heavy curing pressure of real consequences to solidify its core. I told her that I had finally demolished the rotten foundation of their intense entitlement and forced them to rebuild their lives from the absolute ground up. I smiled, looking at the bright morning sun filtering through the green leaves overhead, casting warm golden light across the polished marble. I told Corinne that Garrett was finally learning the true value of an honest day's work, and that Sabrina was finally understanding the actual cost of true independence. The demolition process was ugly, painful, and entirely ruthless, but it was absolutely necessary for any new growth to occur. I stood up, brushing the soft dirt from my knees, feeling lighter and stronger than I had in decades. I had stopped trying to protect them from the world, and by doing so, I had finally given them the opportunity to actually live in it. The warm afternoon sun bathed the cedar planks of my new back porch in a rich golden light. I stood leaning against the smooth wooden railing, holding a simple ceramic mug of black coffee. The massive sprawling mansion that Corinne and I had built decades ago was completely gone. In its place, an incredible transformation was actively taking shape. The heavy rumbling of diesel engines and the rhythmic pounding of steel hammers echoed across the valley. It was not the sound of destruction, but the beautiful, resonant music of a fresh beginning. The Architectural Academy was rising from the earth, a brilliant skeleton of reinforced steel beams and expansive glass panels catching the sunlight. I watched the construction crews working diligently, pouring the concrete foundations that would soon support classrooms, design studios, and workshops. This was no longer a hollow monument to my own ego or a bloated safety net for entitled adults. It was a genuine legacy. Spread out across the large wooden drafting table on my porch were dozens of wide architectural blueprints, fluttering slightly in the gentle spring breeze. Surrounding the table stood 5 young, eager students. They were entirely different from the people who used to occupy my home. These young men and women did not wear expensive designer clothes or drive luxury vehicles. They wore faded jeans, scuffed work boots, and plain cotton shirts. They came from rough neighborhoods and difficult backgrounds, carrying nothing but a fierce, undeniable hunger to build a better life for themselves. A young man named Elias traced his calloused finger along the intricate lines of a structural diagram, asking me a highly technical question about load-bearing distribution. I smiled, placing my coffee mug down on the wooden railing, and walked over to the drafting table. I did not give him the answer immediately. I gently guided him, pointing out the stress factors and the material limitations, asking him to solve the structural puzzle on his own. I watched his brow furrow in deep concentration before a bright, sudden spark of absolute clarity lit up his eyes. He figured it out completely by himself. The profound, genuine pride radiating from his smile was worth more than any amount of money I had ever earned. For decades, I had poured my wealth into a bottomless black hole of family entitlement. I had written countless checks to cover Garrett's massive corporate failures. I had silently funded Sabrina's desperate need to impress elite social circles. I thought that shielding them from every single hardship was the ultimate expression of a father's love. I believed that providing them with a flawless, frictionless life was my primary duty. But standing here mentoring these incredibly driven young adults, I finally understood the catastrophic damage I had caused my own flesh and blood. These students respected the materials they worked with, because they understood the immense effort required to acquire them. They respected my time, because they genuinely valued the knowledge I was sharing. They did not look at me expecting a free handout. They looked at me hoping to learn how to build their own sturdy foundations. I was finally investing my energy into people who actually wanted to learn how to stand, instead of simply waiting to be carried. The afternoon slowly faded into a cool, crisp evening. The construction crews powered down their heavy machinery, and the loud rumbling engines faded into the distance. The students packed up their graphite pencils, their rolled blueprints, and their notebooks, thanking me profusely for my time and my guidance. I watched them walk down the long gravel driveway, talking excitedly amongst themselves about their future projects. They possessed a raw, powerful resilience that my own children had completely lost. I knew that Garrett and Sabrina were currently out there in the cold, unforgiving world, struggling to pay their rent and working exhausting entry-level jobs. I knew they were experiencing the bitter, humiliating taste of failure and the brutal reality of living paycheck to paycheck. It was a painful, agonizing process, but it was absolutely necessary. I walked back to the edge of the cedar porch and looked out over the vast 50 acres of prime real estate. The affordable housing project was already taking shape in the distance, providing safe, beautiful homes for hard-working families. I picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow, deep sip of the dark, bitter liquid. The cool evening wind brushed against my face, carrying the fresh scent of turned earth and pine trees. I thought about Corinne and her profound, pragmatic wisdom. I thought about how long it took me to finally understand her warnings. True love is never about funding someone's bottomless greed. True love is not about placing pillows under them every single time they stumble, or masking their failures with a checkbook. True love is possessing the immense, heartbreaking strength to step aside and let them fall. It is allowing them to hit the solid concrete bottom so they can finally learn how to brace themselves, heal their own wounds, and stand up on their own 2 feet. The sun dipped entirely below the horizon, painting the Hudson Valley sky in deep shades of violet and indigo. The vibrant lights of my new downsized modern home flickered on, casting a warm, inviting glow across the wooden deck. I stood there completely alone, but I did not feel a single ounce of loneliness. I had finally stopped carrying a burden that was never mine to bear. The endless, frantic phone calls demanding money were permanently gone. The toxic, stressful manipulation had completely evaporated. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the cool night air, and simply smiled. I closed my eyes, letting the deep, absolute, unbroken silence of a truly peaceful life wash over me completely. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that shielding our loved ones from the natural consequences of their actions does not protect them. It destroys their ability to thrive. When we confuse financial enabling with genuine affection, we rob people of the vital opportunity to develop resilience, character, and self-respect. True empowerment requires boundaries, and sometimes the most profound act of love is allowing someone to fail so they can finally discover their own strength. Building a lasting legacy is never about passing down unearned wealth, but rather passing down the unbreakable tools required to navigate a difficult world. If you found value in this story of reclaiming boundaries and finding peace, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons.